The silver tray trembled in Helena's hands, and she gripped it tighter so the crystal glasses would not betray her. 6 months ago, she had walked through the doors of Rosewood Manor as its daughter. Tonight, she walked through its corridors as its servant, dressed in a plain gray uniform with a white apron tied stiffly at her waist, carrying refreshments to the very guests who had once called her family the finest in the county. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and diamonds, silk gowns swept across the polished floor, and laughter rang out beneath the great chandelier her mother had chosen years ago, back when the manor still belonged to them. Helena kept her eyes down and her steps light, weaving between clusters of guests who did not spare her a glance, until she reached the center of the room, where her sister stood, glowing beside her betrothed.
"Isn't it dreadful,"
a woman murmured behind a painted fan, not troubling to lower her voice,
"that the elder sister is made to carry the trays while the younger one wears the ring? Their father gambled away everything,"
came the reply, dripping with satisfaction rather than sympathy.
"I heard the family owes more than this house is worth. Poor Helena, from mistress to maid in a single season."
Helena's fingers whitened around the tray. She had grown used to whispers over the past months, but hearing them here, in this room, beneath the portraits of her own grandparents still hanging on the walls, cut deeper than she expected. Her sister, Cordelia, caught her eye across the room and looked away quickly, as though Helena's presence embarrassed her.
"To the future Viscountess," someone called, raising a glass, and the room erupted in applause for Cordelia's diamond ring. A ring paid for, Helena suspected, with money that should have gone toward the debts consuming what remained of their family's name. A tear slipped free before Helena could stop it. She set her jaw and tried to press forward through the crowd, but the tray was heavy, her arms ached from a full day of service, and the guests pressed close on every side, watching her struggle with open curiosity, as though her humiliation were part of the evening's entertainment. "Careful, girl!" a guest snapped when Helena's shoulder brushed his sleeve. "That claret nearly spilled on my coat."
"Forgive me, sir,"
Helena whispered, her voice cracking. Another tear followed the first, and then she could not stop them. She stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, tray shaking, tears streaming freely down her face, while the party continued around her as though she were nothing more than furniture that had briefly malfunctioned. It was then that the room began to still. Conversations faded one by one, starting near the tall doors at the far end of the hall and rippling outward like a stone dropped into a pond. Helena, too lost in her own misery to notice at first, only looked up when she realized the guest who had scolded her had gone pale and taken a full step backward. Duke Christian Ashworth stood just inside the doorway. Helena had heard his name whispered through every room of this house since the day the papers were signed. The creditor who had swallowed her family's estate whole, the man the servants spoke of in hushed, fearful tones, the merchant-turned-nobleman known across the county for his cold calculation and his complete lack of mercy in matters of business. She had pictured him 100 times in the months since, always as some gray, joyless figure counting coins in a dim office. The man crossing the ballroom floor toward her was nothing of the sort. He was younger than she had imagined, tall and severe in a black coat that seemed to command the space around him, his expression unreadable, his pace unhurried and yet somehow impossible to ignore. Every guest in the room parted before him without being asked. "Your Grace," stammered the man who had snapped at Helena moments before, suddenly all smiles. "What an honor that you—" Silence. Christian did not raise his voice, and yet the single word landed like a blow. He turned to survey the guests nearest Helena, his gaze sweeping over the woman with the painted fan, the man with the wine-stained sleeve, all of them suddenly finding great interest in their own shoes. "I have stood in this doorway for the better part of 10 minutes, listening to grown men and women amuse themselves at the expense of a young woman doing honest work. I confess I am at a loss as to when cruelty became fashionable entertainment among people who call themselves guests of quality." No one answered him. No one dared.
Christian turned then, and for the first time, his eyes met Helena's. She braced herself for judgment, for the same cold contempt she had expected from him since the day he took her home. But instead, something in his expression shifted, quiet and unreadable, as he studied her tear-streaked face. "Give me the tray," he said. "Your Grace, Give me the tray, Miss Whitmore." Helena's hands were shaking too badly to argue.
Christian took it from her with an ease that made the silver and crystal look weightless, and set it upon the nearest table without so much as a glance at the guests still gathered to watch. Then he offered her his arm. "You will sit at the head table for the remainder of this evening," he said, loud enough for every ear in the ballroom to catch. "As my guest." A collective gasp swept through the room, sharper than any of the whispers that had come before. Cordelia's smile faltered. Somewhere near the punch table, a glass slipped from someone's fingers and shattered against the floor. Helena stared up at the man the county called Ruthless, utterly unable to understand why he had just upended the entire evening for her sake, and utterly unable, despite everything she believed about him, to pull her hand away from his arm. Morning light fell pale and grey through the tall windows of the study, and Helena stood just inside the door with her hands clasped tightly before her, refusing to let them shake. She had barely slept. The whispers from the ballroom still rang in her ears, tangled up with the memory of Christian's arm beneath her fingers and the stunned silence that had followed them to the head table. She did not understand him, and she did not trust what she could not understand. "You wish to see me, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice as flat as she could manage. Christian sat behind a heavy oak desk stacked with papers, ledgers, and correspondence sealed with wax. He did not look up immediately, and the delay needled at her already frayed nerves. "Sit, Miss Whitmore."
"I would rather stand."
That earned her a glance, brief and assessing, before he returned to the ledger in front of him. "As you wish." Helena's jaw tightened.
"Last night you made a spectacle of kindness in front of the entire county. I confess I cannot decide whether it was pity or performance, Your Grace, but either way, I did not ask for it."
"No," he agreed. "You did not."
"You took my family's home. You turned my father out of the house he built, and now half the county believes I ought to fall at your feet in gratitude because you spared me a single evening's embarrassment. I am not so easily bought." Something flickered across his face, not anger, as she expected, but something closer to weariness. He set down his pen and finally looked at her directly.
"Sit down, Helena."
The use of her given name, without title or formality, startled her enough that she obeyed before she thought better of it, lowering herself into the chair across from his desk.
Christian reached into a drawer and withdrew a heavy leather ledger, worn soft at the corners, and placed it on the desk between them.
"Your father's accounts," he said. "Not the ones he showed his creditors, the true ones." Helena opened the cover with unsteady fingers. Rows of figures marched down the page in a hand she recognized at once as her father's, and her stomach turned cold as she began to understand what she was looking at. Sums borrowed against the estate, again and again, far beyond what she had ever imagined. Wages promised to the staff and never paid. Debts to merchants in Oakhaven and beyond, some stretching back years before the engagement party that had first whispered of ruin. "This cannot be right," she murmured, though even as she said it, she knew it was. "Turn to the marked page." She did, and found a list of names beneath a single heading. Dismissed without wages owed. Names of servants she had known. Old Tom, the groundskeeper, Agnes, who had minded her as a girl, the stable boy who had taught her to ride. All of them let go without a shilling of what they were due, while her father continued to host card parties late into the night. "He told me you seized everything out of greed," Helena said, and her voice had lost its edge, replaced by something smaller and more uncertain. "He said you circled our family like a vulture the moment word of our trouble spread." "Your father borrowed against Rosewood from 3 separate lenders before I ever entered a room with him," Christian said.
When the third came calling with threats of debtor's prison, it was your father himself who sought me out, not the reverse. I did not seize the estate to ruin your family, Miss Whitmore. I purchased the debt to keep it from falling into the hands of men who would have thrown your father in chains and left you and your sister with nothing at all, not even a roof. Then why not simply forgive the debt? Why take the house? Because your father would have borrowed against it again within the season, and this time there would have been no one left willing to intervene. Christian's voice hardened, though not unkindly. I have watched men like him before. Given an inch of mercy, they mistake it for an endless well. The only way to stop the bleeding was to take the estate out of his hands entirely. Helena stared down at the ledger, at the names of servants abandoned without wages, at the years of quiet ruin her father had hidden behind smiles and card games and champagne toasts. Everything she had believed for 6 months, every bitter word she had rehearsed against the man sitting across from her, began to crumble. "Why show me this now?" she asked quietly. "Because you deserved the truth before you spent another evening hating me for a crime that was never mine," Christian said. "And because I intend to remove you from your father's influence entirely, starting tomorrow. You will accompany me to Oakhaven." Helena's head snapped up. "Oakhaven? I have not agreed to—" "You will agree," Christian said, not unkindly, but with the same quiet finality she had heard in the ballroom the night before. "Because staying here means staying within your father's reach, and I do not believe, Miss Whitmore, that either of us wishes to see what he does next." The carriage rattled over the rutted road leading away from Rosewood, and Helena kept her gaze fixed on the passing hedgerows rather than on the man seated across from her. She had packed only what fit in a single traveling case: 2 plain dresses, a shawl that had belonged to her mother, a small tin box of pressed flowers she had kept since girlhood. Everything else remained behind at the manor that no longer belonged to her family, sealed away in rooms she doubted she would see again for some time. "You need not sit as though I mean to have you clapped in irons, Miss Whitmore," Christian said, not looking up from the papers balanced on his knee. "Forgive me if a carriage ride away from everything I have ever known does not put me at my ease, Your Grace." He made no reply to that, only turned a page and continued reading, and Helena found his silence somehow more unsettling than conversation would have been. She studied him from beneath lowered lashes, the sharp line of his jaw, the ink stains on 2 of his fingers, the way his brow furrowed slightly over whatever figures occupied him. He did not look like a man plotting cruelty. He looked like a man with a great deal of business and very little patience for anything beyond it. The journey stretched on through the afternoon, the road climbing away from the gentle hills around Rosewood and into busier country, where farm carts and drovers with their flocks of sheep crowded the lanes. Helena watched the changing landscape with a knot of dread tightening in her chest. Oakhaven. She knew the name only from her father's occasional mention of merchants and trade contacts, a market town of some size, but nothing more. "What am I to do there?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Christian glanced up. "You will have a room of your own, meals provided, and a task suited to your particular talents, once I have determined what those talents are." A pause. "You are not a prisoner, Miss Whitmore, whatever your expression suggests you believe." "Forgive me if I find that difficult to accept from the man who holds every scrap of my family's fortune in his hands." "I hold your father's debts," Christian corrected. "Not your fortune, and certainly not your person. You are free to leave my household whenever you choose. I simply doubt you have anywhere else to go that would not place you back within your father's reach, and I do not think, in your heart, you wish to return to that." Helena had no answer for this, because it was true, and the truth of it stung more than any accusation could have. By late afternoon, the carriage rolled into Oakhaven proper, and Helena leaned toward the window despite herself, curiosity overtaking her wariness. The town was smaller than the capital, but bustling all the same. Cobbled streets lined with shop fronts selling wool and linen, a church spire rising above slate rooftops, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery as they passed. Merchants called out from stalls,
and the whole town hummed with an energy quite unlike the quiet grandeur of Rosewood. The carriage finally slowed before a townhouse set back from the main street, modest by the standards of a duke's holdings, but handsome nonetheless, with ivy climbing one wall and tall windows catching the last of the afternoon light. Helena had braced herself, without quite realizing it, for something colder, a bare room perhaps, or quarters shared with the household staff, some reminder that she remained, in the eyes of the world, a servant working off her family's shame. Instead, a housekeeper met them at the door, a stout, kindly-faced woman named Mrs.
Perry, who greeted Helena with a warm nod rather than the guarded suspicion Helena had expected.
"I've had the blue room made up for you, miss," Mrs. Perry said, leading her up a narrow staircase. "His Grace sent word ahead you'd be wanting a proper bed and a washstand of your own, nothing shared." Helena followed in bewildered silence until Mrs. Perry opened a door onto a modest but genuinely pleasant chamber. A 4-poster bed with clean linens, a small writing desk beneath the window, a vase of late summer flowers already set upon the sill. It was nothing so grand as her old room at Rosewood, but it was, unmistakably, a room meant for a guest rather than a prisoner or a maid. "There must be some mistake," Helena murmured, more to herself than to the housekeeper. "No mistake I'm aware of, miss. His Grace was quite particular about it."
Mrs. Perry busied herself straightening the coverlet, then paused at the door.
"He's not the man folks make him out to be, you know. Cold in business, perhaps, but never cruel where it costs him nothing to be kind." Helena stood alone in the quiet room long after the housekeeper's footsteps had faded down the stairs, turning the woman's words over in her mind. She thought of the ledger on Christian's desk, of the names of servants dismissed without wages, of the arm he had offered her before an entire ballroom of judgment. Nothing about him fit the shape of the villain she had built in her thoughts over 6 long, bitter months, and she did not know, standing in this unfamiliar room in an unfamiliar town, what to make of the man who kept surprising her instead. 2 days passed in the Oakhaven townhouse before Christian summoned Helena again, and when he did, it was not to the study, but to the edge of the garden, where a narrow gravel path disappeared behind a wall of overgrown hedges.
"I have a task for you," he said, leading her along the path without further explanation.
"Something to occupy your hands, while I decide what else you might be suited for." Helena followed, curiosity warring with her lingering wariness. The path wound past a kitchen garden gone slightly wild and a row of apple trees heavy with early fruit, until it opened onto a clearing where a glasshouse stood, its panes clouded with grime and streaked green with moss, half swallowed by ivy that had crept up one wall and in through a broken pane near the roof.
"This belonged to my late aunt," Christian said, stopping before the door. "She had a passion for rare botany, spent a small fortune importing specimens from every corner of the world. When she passed, no one in the household had the knowledge or the inclination to maintain it, and it has sat neglected these 3 years." He pushed open the door, releasing a gust of warm, earthy air. "It is yours to restore, if you are willing." Helena stepped inside and stopped short. Beneath the grime and the tangle of dead vines, she could see the bones of something extraordinary. Raised beds arranged in careful rows, copper watering cans hung along one wall, glass cloches stacked in a corner. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dirty panes, illuminating clusters of green, struggling valiantly against years of neglect. "You expect me to labor in a garden," Helena said, though her tone lacked the sharpness she intended. "I expect you to work off a portion of your family's debt through honest effort, the same as I expect of any member of my household," Christian said. "What form that effort takes is, within reason, left to your discretion. I merely thought this a more fitting use of your time than scrubbing floors." He left her there without waiting for a reply, and Helena stood alone amid the ruin of the glasshouse, uncertain whether she had been given a punishment or, strangely, a gift. She did not know, at first, why her fingers itched to touch the leaves nearest her. It had been years since she allowed herself to think of the small herb garden she had tended in secret behind Rosewood's kitchen as a girl, before her mother's death,
before propriety demanded she abandon such unladylike interests in favor of needlework and pianoforte. She had buried that old fascination deep, certain it had no place in the life expected of a gentleman's daughter. But here, surrounded by decay and possibility both, something in her stirred back to life. By midday, she had cleared a full bed of dead growth, and beneath the debris she found survivors. A cluster of feverfew gone leggy but alive, a stand of lavender fighting valiantly through weeds, and near the back wall, half hidden behind a fallen trellis, a specimen she did not immediately recognize. Its leaves were narrow and silvery, faintly aromatic when crushed between her fingers, and something in its structure reminded her of illustrations she had once pored over in her mother's old botanical journals. She worked through the afternoon with her sleeves rolled and her hands stained with soil, forgetting, for the first time in months, to feel the weight of her circumstances. It was only when the light through the glass began to dim that she realized she was being watched. Christian stood just outside the door, half hidden by the ivy, his coat discarded somewhere and his sleeves rolled in a manner she had not expected of him. She could not say how long he had been there. "You have a talent for it," he said when she caught his eye, making no apology for the observation.
"I had a small garden once,"
Helena admitted, brushing dirt from her hands. "Before my mother died, my father thought it beneath the family's standing and had it torn up within the year." Something crossed Christian's face, not quite sympathy, but close to it. "And yet here you are, 3 years' neglect undone in a single afternoon." "I have only cleared a single bed, Your Grace. There is a great deal more to be done before you might call it undone." "Then you had best begin tomorrow at first light, if you mean to see it through." A pause, and then, almost reluctantly, he added, "The silver-leafed plant near the back wall, do you know it?" Helena glanced toward the specimen that had caught her attention earlier. "I confess I do not, though I suspect it may have some medicinal use. The leaves carry a strong scent when crushed." "My aunt called it silverwort. She used it in a tea she swore cured half the ailments of the parish." Christian studied Helena a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression. "She would have liked you, I think." He left before Helena could form a reply, and she stood amid the ruined glass house long after his footsteps had faded, turning his words over with the same careful attention she had given the silverwort's fragile leaves. By the 8th day, Helena had fallen into a rhythm she had not expected to find so quickly. Mornings in the glass house with soil beneath her nails, afternoons sorting seed and pressing herbs for drying, and a growing list of supplies she needed from the market square to continue her work properly. Mrs. Perry had offered to send a footman along, but Helena declined, glad of the chance to walk the town on her own 2 feet and feel, for an hour at least, like an ordinary woman going about ordinary business, rather than a debtor's daughter under a duke's watch. The market square hummed with its usual midday business, stall-holders calling out prices for wool and tin pots, a fishmonger's cart drawing flies despite the ice packed around his catch. Helena moved from stall to stall with her basket over her arm, purchasing twine, a new pair of shears, a small sack of bone meal for the beds she meant to replant come autumn. She did not see her father until he had already closed the distance between them. "Helena." His voice, once warm with affection whenever he called her name, now carried only a thin, brittle edge. He looked older than she remembered from the engagement party, his coat rumpled, his eyes sunken with whatever troubles had followed him since Christian banned him from Rosewood's grounds. "I have been searching half this county for word of where he'd taken you." "Father," Helena's grip tightened on her basket, "you should not be here." "Should not be here," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. "I am your father, girl. I have every right to speak with my own daughter, whatever that man has told you to believe otherwise." Helena glanced past him, half hoping for some familiar face among the crowd, but the market carried on around them, oblivious. "What do you want?" "I want what is owed me." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though it lost none of its urgency. "You are in his household now, in his confidence. You must have seen his ledgers, his accounts, the papers that prove what he has taken from us. Bring them to me, Helena." and I can go before the magistrate and have the whole arrangement overturned. We could have Rosewood back within the month."
"The ledgers prove nothing but your own ruin, father."
Helena's voice shook, though she forced herself to hold his gaze.
"I have seen them. I know what you did to the staff, what you borrowed and never repaid. Christian did not steal our home. You gambled it away long before he ever set foot in it."
Her father's expression twisted, affection curdling into something colder. "He has poisoned you against me already, has he? Filled your head with his lies while you play at gardening in his household like some kept—"
"That is quite enough."
Christian's voice cut through the market noise, and Helena turned to find him crossing the square with the same unhurried, commanding stride she had first seen in the ballroom at Rosewood. Several nearby stallholders paused their business to watch, sensing trouble the way townsfolk always seem to.
Ashworth. Her father's tone shifted instantly, wariness replacing bluster.
"I was merely speaking with my daughter. Surely even you cannot object to a father greeting his own family."
"I object to a man violating the terms of his banishment,"
Christian said, his voice level but carrying an edge Helena had not heard from him before.
"You were told, quite plainly, that you were not to set foot within 10 miles of Oakhaven while your debts remain unsettled, and yet here you stand, cornering your daughter in a public square and demanding she steal from my household on your behalf."
"I demanded nothing of the sort."
"I heard enough to know precisely what you demanded."
Christian stepped between Helena and her father, not touching either of them, but placing himself firmly enough that the message was unmistakable.
"You have one chance to leave this town of your own accord. If you are seen within its boundaries again, I will see to it that every merchant, every innkeeper,
and every lender from here to the capital knows exactly the sort of man you are. You will find no credit, no lodging, and no sympathy anywhere I have influence. And I assure you, that influence reaches further than you imagine."
Her father's face drained of color, bluster giving way to something closer to fear. He looked once more at Helena, as though searching for some flicker of the daughter who might still take his side. But Helena only met his gaze steadily and said nothing.
"You will regret this," he muttered, though the threat carried none of its earlier weight. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, his footsteps quickening as he went, and within moments the market swallowed him whole, as though he had never been there at all. Helena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding.
"You did not need to intervene."
"I disagree," Christian said, watching the space where her father had vanished with an expression she could not quite read.
"A man desperate enough to use his own daughter as a means of theft is not a man who stops at words. I would rather he fear my name than test how far his desperation might carry him."
Helena looked up at him, something warm and unfamiliar, unsettling the careful distance she had tried to maintain since the day she arrived in Oakhaven.
"Thank you,"
she said quietly, and meant it more than she expected to. By the 12th evening, Helena had brewed the same pot of tea 4 times over, adjusting the ratio of silverwort to dried lavender each time until she was satisfied the flavor was neither too bitter nor too faint. She poured a cup, watched the pale gold liquid settle, and steeled herself for what she meant to do next. She found Christian in his study, as she had expected, a single lamp burning low against the evening dark, and papers spread across his desk in the same careful disorder she had come to associate with him. He looked up when she entered, one eyebrow rising slightly at the sight of the tray in her hands.
"Miss Whitmore, I do not recall summoning you."
"You did not," Helena said, setting the tray on the corner of his desk with more confidence than she felt.
"I have come of my own accord, Your Grace, with a proposition I believe warrants your attention."
Something flickered across his face, curiosity, perhaps, or simple surprise at her boldness. He set down his pen. "Go on, then." Helena poured a cup and set it before him.
"This is made from the silverwort growing in your aunt's glasshouse, blended with lavender and a touch of chamomile from the beds I restored last month. I have been testing it these past weeks, first on myself, then on Mrs. Perry, who suffers dreadfully from headaches and swears this eased hers within the hour." Christian lifted the cup and studied it before drinking, his expression unreadable as the flavor settled on his tongue.
"It is good," he admitted, sounding faintly surprised by his own verdict. "Better than good."
"I believe it could be sold," Helena said, pressing forward before her nerve failed her. "Not merely given away to household staff with headaches, but sold properly, as a medicinal tea, to apothecaries and merchants who would pay well for something both effective and pleasant to drink. Oakhaven has no shortage of visiting tradesmen,
And the capital's autumn trade fair draws buyers from across the country every year. I have made inquiries. The fair accepts new vendors so long as they can demonstrate quality and secure a booth in advance." Christian regarded her for a long moment, and Helena forced herself not to look away, not to let the old habit of deference creep back into her posture. "You have thought this through in some detail," he said at last.
"I have had little else to occupy my evenings, Your Grace."
A small, unexpected smile tugged at her mouth. "I would require funding for the booth, for proper glass bottles and labels, and for enough dried stock to see us through the fair's 3 days. In return, I propose a share of whatever profit the venture returns, not as charity, but as fair payment for the labor and knowledge I bring to it." "You are proposing a business arrangement," Christian said slowly, as though testing the shape of the idea aloud. "Between a duke and the daughter of his debtor." "I am proposing an arrangement between two people who each stand to gain something from it," Helena corrected. "I do not ask you to forget what my father did, or to pretend my family owes you nothing. I ask only that you judge this venture on its own merits, the same as you would judge any investment brought before you." For a moment, Christian said nothing, turning the teacup slowly in his hands as though weighing her words alongside the tea itself. Helena's heart pounded through the silence, certain she had overreached, certain he would remind her of her place with the same cool authority he had shown her father in the market square. Instead, he set down the cup and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the guarded distance of their first meetings, nor the quiet protectiveness he had shown against her father, but something closer to genuine respect. "You remind me of my aunt," he said. "She built this glass house from nothing but stubbornness and a fascination with things most people overlooked. She would have approved of this scheme, I think, and she was rarely wrong about such matters." "Is that a yes, Your Grace?" "It is a yes, on the condition that you cease addressing me with such formality when we are discussing matters of business between partners." A faint, unfamiliar warmth crept into his voice. "Christian will do." Helena felt something loosen in her chest that had been drawn tight since the night of her sister's engagement party. Weeks of grief and suspicion and careful guardedness easing, if only slightly, in the face of his unexpected trust. "Very well, Christian," she said, testing the name aloud, and found she did not dislike the sound of it. "Then I shall need your signature on the fair's vendor application by week's end, and I shall need to discuss the matter of bottles with the glassblower on High Street before his stock is claimed by someone less deserving." "You have clearly already decided how this will proceed, with or without my involvement." "I had hoped for your involvement," Helena admitted, more honestly than she intended. "But I would have found a way regardless." Christian's mouth curved, not quite a full smile, but close enough that Helena found herself studying it longer than propriety strictly allowed. "I do not doubt that for a moment, Miss Whitmore. Not for a single moment." The capital's autumn trade fair sprawled across the great square before St. Albans Cathedral, a sea of striped canvas awnings and crowded stalls stretching further than Helena could see in any direction. She had never witnessed anything like it. Merchants hawking bolts of silk and tin cookware, a man selling mechanical songbirds that chirped when wound, the air thick with the smell of roasted chestnuts and the noise of 1,000 voices competing to be heard. Their booth sat toward the front of the merchants' row, a spot Christian had secured with a fee Helena suspected was considerably higher than he let on. Rows of small glass bottles lined the table, each stoppered with cork and labeled in Helena's own careful hand. Ashworth Herbal Blend, Silverwort and Lavender. She had spent the better part of the previous evening arranging them just so, certain the fair would swallow their little venture whole among grander displays of imported spice and fine porcelain.
"You are wringing your hands," Christian observed, standing beside her in a coat considerably plainer than the one he usually wore to matters of business, as though he understood instinctively that a merchant's booth called for a merchant's dress rather than a duke's finery.
"I am nervous," Helena admitted. "What if no one buys it? What if they take one taste and declare it fit only for household headaches, nothing worth their coin?"
"Then we shall have learned something valuable at a modest cost," Christian said, though his tone carried none of the coldness such words might once have held. "But I do not believe that will be the outcome." His confidence was rewarded within the hour. A physician from the capital, drawn by curiosity toward the modest booth, sampled a cup and returned twice more before purchasing a full dozen bottles for his practice.
A merchant's wife, complaining loudly to her companion of a persistent headache, tried the tea on Helena's recommendation and left declaring it the finest remedy she had found in years, promising to send half her acquaintance to the booth before the day's end. By midday, word had spread through the fairground with the particular speed that gossip and good fortune both seemed to share. A queue formed before the booth, merchants and apothecaries and curious ladies of fashion, all eager to sample what everyone now called simply the Oakhaven tea. Helena poured cup after cup, answered questions about the silverwort's properties, wrapped bottles in brown paper for buyers eager to carry a dozen home, and found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember, when a stout gentleman insisted the tea had already cured a headache he had not even mentioned suffering from until that very moment. Christian worked beside her the entire day, handling coin and correspondence with the same brisk efficiency he brought to his ledgers, though Helena noticed he had abandoned his usual reserve somewhere between the 2nd hour and the 5th. He spoke easily with the merchants, laughed at a joke told by an elderly apothecary, scooped up a fallen bottle before it could shatter, and returned it to the small boy's mother with a gentleness Helena would never have credited him with, had she not witnessed it herself. By the time the fair's bell rang to signal the close of trading, their stock was entirely sold, the table bare but for a scattering of coin, and the empty crates that had carried their bottles from Oakhaven that morning. Helena sat down heavily on an overturned barrel, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure, and did the sums in her head twice over to be certain she had not miscounted. "We have earned enough,"
she said, disbelief coloring her voice.
"Enough to clear the greater portion of my family's remaining debt in a single day."
"More than enough, I think, once the physician's order and the apothecary's standing arrangement are accounted for." Christian settled onto a crate across from her, loosening his cravat in a manner entirely unbecoming of a duke and entirely endearing to Helena, who found she could not look away.
"I could not have done this without your faith in the venture," she said quietly.
"You had no reason to trust a scheme proposed by a woman with dirt beneath her fingernails and nothing but a teapot to recommend her." "I had every reason," Christian said, his voice softer than she had heard it since the night in his study when he first showed her the ledger. "I have watched you these past weeks, Helena. I have watched you take a ruined glass house and coax it back to life, take a family's disgrace and turn it towards something worth building, take every reason the world gave you to despair and refuse every single one of them." Helena felt heat rise to her cheeks, unaccustomed to praise so plainly spoken. "You make it sound grander than it was. I only tended some plants and brewed some tea." "You did a great deal more than that, and I think you know it." Christian's gaze held hers across the space between them, and for the first time since the night of her sister's engagement party, Helena saw him smile, not the faint curve of amusement she had glimpsed once or twice before, but a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed the severity of his face into something she found she wanted very much to see again. Around them, the fairground began to empty as vendors packed their wares and the crowds thinned toward the cathedral's evening bells, but Helena remained seated on her overturned barrel, caught in the warmth of Christian's smile,
wondering when exactly the ruthless Duke of the County's whispers had become something else entirely in her eyes. 5 days after the autumn trade fair, Helena stood once more before the front steps of Rosewood Manor, though nothing about the moment resembled her last departure from its doors. She wore a traveling dress of her own choosing, plain but well-made, purchased with coin she had earned rather than coin given out of pity.
In her gloved hand she carried a leather satchel containing the full remainder of her family's debt, converted to notes and coin after weeks of careful accounting alongside Christian's steward. The manor's stone facade looked the same as it always had, ivy climbing toward familiar windows, but Helena herself felt entirely changed walking up the drive. Christian accompanied her, though he kept a measured distance as they climbed the steps, allowing her the moment without crowding it. Inside, they found the study largely as it had been the morning he first showed her the ledger, though the room now felt smaller somehow, less imposing than it had when she stood there as a frightened, angry young woman with nothing to her name.
"The full sum," Helena said, setting the satchel upon the desk.
"Every shilling my father owed, cleared." Christian opened the satchel and counted it with the same careful attention he gave any transaction, though Helena suspected he already knew, to the last coin, precisely what it contained. "It is done then," he said quietly, closing the satchel once more. "Your family's debt to me no longer exists." "No longer exists," Helena repeated, testing the words, waiting for the relief she had imagined feeling for weeks to finally arrive. It came, but quieter than she expected, tangled with something else she could not immediately name. A knock sounded at the study door before either of them could say more, and Mrs. Perry's counterpart at Rosewood, an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Hale, who had served the family since before Helena's birth, entered with an apologetic bob of her head. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, Miss Helena, but there's a caller asking for the young miss most urgently. Says she won't leave until she's spoken with her." Helena frowned. "Who is it?" The answer came before Mrs. Hale could speak, as Cordelia swept past the housekeeper into the study, her fine gown from the engagement party replaced by something considerably plainer, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from what looked like days of weeping rather than hours. "Helena," Cordelia's voice cracked on the single word, and for a moment the sisters simply stared at one another, the memory of that humiliating evening hanging unspoken between them.
"Cordelia, what has happened?"
"He has broken the engagement." Cordelia's composure crumbled entirely, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth before continuing. "Lord Pemberton, the moment word spread that father's debts had left nothing behind for a dowry, he called on his solicitor before he even called on me. I received a letter, Helena, a letter, after everything." Helena felt an old, familiar bitterness rise in her chest, memories of Cordelia's diamond ring catching candlelight while Helena carried trays through a room full of mockery. But beneath it, unexpectedly, she felt something closer to sympathy than satisfaction. "I am sorry," Helena said, and found she meant it despite everything. "Sorry?" Cordelia's laugh was thin and bitter. "You have every reason to gloat, and instead you offer me sympathy. I do not deserve it. I said nothing when they mocked you at my own engagement party. I looked away rather than defend my own sister, and now I understand precisely what it feels like to be discarded the moment one's fortune disappears." Christian, who had remained silent through the exchange, glanced toward Helena with an unreadable expression, clearly leaving the matter entirely in her hands. "You were frightened," Helena said slowly, working through the tangle of old resentment and unexpected pity in equal measure. "Frightened of losing your own place in a world that judges women by their dowries and their connections rather than their character. I do not excuse it, Cordelia, but I understand it rather better now than I did 3 months ago." "What am I to do?" Cordelia's voice broke entirely. "I have no fortune, no prospects, and a mother too consumed by her own grief to offer any guidance." Helena glanced at Christian,
who gave the smallest nod, as though granting permission for whatever she meant to offer without needing to be asked. "Come to Oakhaven," Helena said. "I have a venture that could use another set of capable hands, and I imagine you have connections among the capital's merchants that could prove useful to it, whatever else has changed." Cordelia stared at her sister as though she scarcely recognized the woman standing before her, and perhaps, Helena thought, she did not. The servant weeping over a silver tray had become someone else entirely in the months between. Once Cordelia had gone to gather her belongings, promising to follow within the week, Helena found herself alone with Christian once more, the study quiet around them. "You did not need to offer her that," Christian said. "No," Helena agreed, "but I found, rather to my surprise, that I wanted to." She studied him a moment, some question forming she had not quite dared voice before now. "What happens now, Christian? The debt is cleared. I am, by every measure that matters, free to go wherever I choose." Christian's expression shifted, the careful composure she had come to know slipping for just a moment into something rawer, more uncertain than she had ever seen from him. "I confess," he said, "I had not fully considered what it would mean to watch you walk out that door with nothing left binding you here, and I find, now that the moment has arrived, that I am considerably less prepared for it than I expected to be." Morning arrived over Rosewood Manor with the kind of soft, golden light that made even the most ordinary things look touched by something finer, and Helena found Christian waiting for her on the terrace overlooking the gardens, exactly where a footman had said he would be. She had not slept much the night before, turning over his words from the study again and again, considerably less prepared for it than I expected to be, until sleep finally claimed her somewhere near dawn. She had woken with a strange, quiet certainty settled in her chest, though she could not have named it until she stepped out onto the terrace and saw him standing there, hands clasped behind his back, watching the mist lift slowly off the lawns below. "You wished to see me," she said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the words she had spoken to him weeks ago in this very house, in a room far colder than the morning air around them now. "I did." Christian turned to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something like nervousness cross his features, an expression entirely unfamiliar on a man who had faced down her father in a crowded market square without so much as a flicker of hesitation. "I have spent the better part of the night attempting to compose what I meant to say to you, and I find I have failed rather completely at every version I attempted." "That does not sound like the man who once told me he had never lost an argument in a boardroom in his life." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Boardrooms are considerably simpler than this." Helena stepped closer, the morning dew soaking faintly through the hem of her dress, though she scarcely noticed it. "Then perhaps you ought to abandon whatever speech you composed and simply speak plainly. I have found, in my dealings with you, that plain speech tends to serve you rather better than careful phrasing." "Very well." Christian drew a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the guarded distance she remembered from their first meeting in this house. "When I first took Rosewood's debt, I told myself it was a matter of business, nothing more. A reckless man's ruin that needed managing before it consumed 2 innocent daughters along with him. I believed that entirely, Helena, for longer than I care to admit. And now? Now I have watched you take every misfortune placed before you and turn it into something worth admiring. I have watched you forgive a sister who did nothing to defend you, offer her kindness she did not ask for and perhaps did not deserve. I have watched you build an entire venture from a ruined glasshouse and a stubborn refusal to be defeated by circumstance. And I find, somewhere in the watching, that what began as an obligation became something I can no longer call by so simple a name." Helena's breath caught, though she said nothing, afraid that speaking might somehow break whatever fragile thing was unfolding between them. "I am not asking you to stay as my ward, or my business partner, or any arrangement that keeps a careful distance between us," Christian continued,
his composure fraying at the edges in a way that made the words feel more honest than anything he had ever said to her. "I am asking you to stay as my wife, Helena. Not out of gratitude for anything I have done, and not out of any obligation remaining from your father's debts, because there is none left to speak of. I am asking because I cannot picture this estate, or any life beyond it, without you standing somewhere in the middle of it." For a long moment, Helena said nothing at all, letting the weight of his words settle over her alongside the morning light. She thought of the ballroom where he had first taken the tray from her shaking hands, of the ledger that had shattered every belief she held about him, of the greenhouse where something long buried in her had stirred back to life, of the market square where he had stood between her and her father without hesitation, of the fair where she had seen him smile for the very first time. Every cruelty she had once attributed to him, she understood now, had only ever been aimed at protecting something: her family's ruin from growing worse, her own future from her father's recklessness, and, in ways she had not fully recognized until this very moment, her. "You once told me," Helena said slowly, "that you had watched men mistake mercy for an endless well, and that the only way to stop the bleeding was to take matters entirely out of their hands. I thought you meant only my father. I understand now you meant a great many things, all of them born from the same fierce, unyielding care you have never quite known how to soften into gentler words." "Is that your answer?" Christian asked, something raw and hopeful breaking through his usual composure. Helena closed the last of the distance between them and took his hand, the same hand that had once lifted a heavy tray from her trembling fingers before an entire ballroom of judgment. "My answer is yes, Christian. Not out of gratitude, and not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I have come to know the man beneath the ruthless reputation, and I find I do not wish to spend another morning anywhere he is not." Below the terrace, the mist had lifted fully from the lawns, revealing the gardens Helena had once wept across as a servant carrying trays for guests who mocked her misfortune. The estate stretched out before them now, restored and thriving, no longer a symbol of her family's ruin, but the beginning of something she had built with her own 2 hands and now would share, fully and freely, with the man beside her. Christian raised her hand to his lips, and together they looked out over Rosewood's grounds. No longer creditor and debtor, no longer duke and servant, but 2 equals standing at the threshold of a life neither had expected to find, ready to build it together, one steady morning at a time.